Welcome, guys, to Justice is a Process today, and I want to talk to you about the Rick Chow verdict because it's the verdict that everybody's been talking about, and it's a verdict that a lot of people are saying they're very surprised about, even though they shouldn't be surprised about it, in my opinion. And if you followed on this channel, I think you would you followed our coverage intently, you would understand that this was not a surprise of a verdict, but as many people are making it out to be if you're just following a blurb or a headline or one of the things that you might see on X. And I understand that's not necessarily a hugely popular sentiment because there are a lot of people that are upset with the way the verdict went. But the reality of the situation is, in this case, is that the law worked the way it was supposed to work. And the situation that a lot of people gloss over is that this young man entered an establishment with a firearm. And again, many people, I saw many people come into my comments, come into the lives, and one of the debatable things, which the judge did not allow, which the state did not accurately present, and it only came out after the jury started deliberating, that in fact, the phones that Cyrus had did not actually have any ability to make any electronic payments. And many people are saying, I don't care. He came in and he was treated rudely. Look, if you watch that video and you watch that video honestly, when a young man, I don't care what race or persuasion they are, when someone walks into a convenience store, they have a firearm in their hoodie, they have a backpack which has really nothing in it, and they start walking around the store, picking up items. And what you understand is when he picked up those items, if he didn't have money, then we can infer the intent of what he was attempting or thinking about doing. Because he wasn't thinking, there was no lawful way he could take the water out of the store. Okay? There was no lawful way he could take anything out of that store. So the moment he walks into that store, if we're honestly talking about it, he had no lawful reason to be in that store in terms of, unless he was using the bathroom, but to touch any product, he didn't have a mechanism to which to buy the products he was going in. He removed 4 items from, meaning those water bottles, from the water cooler. For what purpose? And that is something that has been glossed over. And when I've watched and again, I've been watching closely some of the press conferences and all the things, and say it doesn't matter. He is a black child who was shot in the back, who was targeted. Well, it does matter. It does matter. And I don't care what color the person is. When you walk into an establishment and you have no money and you have no means of which to make a purchase, and you're picking items up, there's only one way you thought you were going to get that out of the store. And on top of that, potentially maybe with a gun in your pocket, he was thinking about getting it out one way and potentially even doing something even worse than just taking waters. Now, he didn't do that. He's 14. He's clearly wanting to engage with a lifestyle that he really, at that age, as we all know, and if we speak honestly about this, the way the brain isn't developed, you're not thinking about the long-term nature of your decisions, and you're doing stupid things. And that's exactly what he was doing when he walked in that store. The good news is he lost his nerve. The sad news is the Chows, because he had something in his sweatshirt, did confront him. And then the young man, instead of staying around, but see, the problem is, and what isn't talked about is, he could have stayed around and said, let me show you, I don't have anything, right? The storekeeper has a right to inquire of someone when they walk on there. Because remember, at the end of the day, it's private property. He walks through those doors. It's not a public place. It's private property of the storekeeper. You walk in and you're subject to scrutiny. You're subject to being asked about what's going on. It's the property of the storekeeper. And the problem is he could not answer any of those questions without showing that he had a gun in his sweatshirt. So that's another problem. See, the jury saw all this. So what does he do? He runs. And that's the danger of what was going on. He runs, and then what do we have at that point? Yes, it was 139 yards or 130 yards, depending on they get down the road. The Chows are running after him. Mr. Chow's son starts the pursuit. Mr. Chow starts pursuing with his son, who said he's got a water. They're trying to stop him, and everything then evolves. And Mr. Chow's decision to pursue is, whether you like it or not, his son is the one who decides that. But his son was not armed. His son was being an equally dumb young man to go pursue someone when he shouldn't have. But the son starts the pursuit. The father goes with him. And the rest, unfortunately, happens. And I understand, yes, there is a history with the Chows of being aggressive, which is why, you know what? There was a punishment here. Maybe not the punishment that everyone else who would have liked, who wanted to see Mr. Chow go away for the rest of his life. But he did spend 3 years in jail waiting on trial, okay? So he learned that, you know what? That behavior doesn't go untouched. And I'm not unhappy that he didn't face trial. I think it happened exactly the way it should have. To not have charged Mr. Chow would have been a grave injustice. And Cyrus did get justice because he got a trial. He got a public hearing. He got the law to review everything. And Mr. Chow had to sit for 3 years and wait for that. He had to pay big money to attorneys. He may still face civil liability, which is a totally different question. And he should potentially have to answer for that because of the reckless actions of what he did. But the question is, was it gross? He wasn't even being charged with negligence or recklessness. He was being charged with an intent to gun this child down. And that is not what happened in this case. And the jury made the correct verdict. Because as they go out into the street and they recklessly chase this young man, no question, it was not the best decision to do. It was a terrible decision, and it had terrible consequences for everyone involved. But they chase him down the street. And when they do, this young man does the Chows say he points the gun. And there's no reason to believe that that didn't happen. And I know it's a hard thing that the supporters of Cyrus want to say, no, that didn't happen. The witnesses didn't see it. These witnesses were 130 feet away. They were in a car. They did not have the best vantage point. But what we do know, and what is always important, is this was not a manufactured story. This is a story that was told from the moment it was reported on 911 to the moment that people get on the scene, and it was backed up by an actual gun at the scene. By an actual gun at the scene. And it's unfortunate that it unfolded the way it did, that the gun came out, and that this happened. It's extremely unfortunate. It's very sad. It's terrible. It's horrific. And it has horrific consequences for everyone involved. From his family, from this young man's family, to even the Chows. And I'm sure Mr. Chow deeply regrets and would do it differently if he could do it. If he would never have run out of that store, I'm sure now. I'm sure his son would have never run out of the store. Now, in the street, when that gun was being pointed in the direction, once it had all been said and done, he had no choice but to do what he did. Because a gun was being pointed in his direction. Now, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was made up. But we didn't have to conclude that that's exactly what happened. And I'm not concluding that that's exactly what happened. What I'm saying, when a case like this is brought, the state has the obligation to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the only potential outcome that could have happened in the case was that Mr. Chow shot with malice, with intent to kill, that he shot this child, and that there was no other reason that was lawful, that self-defense wasn't present. And I understand, yes, the state, what we're saying that they started the feud, that they started the fight. But the problem is if Mr. Chow had been the one behind their cash register, and he had pursued him out, and he had confronted him, and he was the aggressor in those instances, then yes, it would have been a much harder case for Mr. Chow to win. But because Mr. Chow was not that person, and he was coming out after the fact, and he had observed his son is already in pursuit, even though, yes, they were kind of together, but his son begins the pursuit. His wife begins the pursuit. His wife and his son are the ones that are beginning the confrontation. Mr. Chow doesn't get the responsibility. Then it became a question of exactly when does he enter the equation. And then when Mr. Chow says, the duty to retreat, drop it, and there's no evidence beyond a reasonable, there's no evidence to say beyond a reasonable doubt that he didn't do this. Okay? Because these eyewitnesses were not on top of this thing. There's not a video that shows what happened. And these are statements that were made in proximity to essentially, they were made directly after the fact. He rendered aid. He did everything you're supposed to do when you shoot in self-defense. He did not go back to his store. He did not leave him there to die. He rendered aid. And in fact, as you heard, he was doing things that the lady that was helping with the CPR said she'd never seen other people do when they did CPR. And yes, I am not supporting Mr. Chow. Okay? What I'm trying to do is explain the verdict and why this jury got it right. This was, and here's the thing. You're not, race has come into the equation in a big way. But it seems like everyone is forgetting that the individual who did the closing argument for the defense, who put together this argument, who handled many of the key examinations in this case, was a very, very, very impressive attorney who was also a black attorney, who was the same race as the individual who lost his life in this case. That is an individual who I don't believe if he would have looked at this case and thought that this was a guy, he said it himself in the closing argument. If he would have believed that Mr. Chow just gunned this kid down because of the color of his skin, because he wanted to kill the child, he would have been nowhere near this case. And that gets forgotten. This was not some scenario where you had a white down, like it would have been maybe 40, 50 years ago, where you had a white justice system come in and essentially free this man. That's not what happened. What you had were individuals who fairly applied the law, looked at the law, tried the case, questioned the case, asked questions where the questions belong to be asked. And a jury stepped up, and I don't know what the makeup of that jury was, but I'm assuming it was a fair makeup to both the victim and to the defendant, and delivered a verdict that was supported by the law. The state overreached here. And the state did not have to charge 15 hours afterwards. They could have developed the case further. They could have figured out charges that might have been better and more appropriate for the case. Whatever they could have developed or done. But they instead went on emotion. And that emotion was that this child did not steal and that he was shot in the back, at least the way they told it. But the problem was their own expert said she couldn't rule out that he could have been aiming the gun when he was shot. And that alone is enough reasonable doubt to throw the case out. Because if that exists, you don't get to just push past that. You don't get to just forget that there's doubt or that reasonable doubt exists. That's not how the justice system works. It's not, and it's exactly what we don't want the justice system to do. Because this is a hard case. This is one of the hardest cases that you're going to find. Because a young child lost his life. And there's nothing worse than that. And it's a sad case. And it's one that's outrageous. And on first look, on first thought, on first glance, it's easy to just say, you know what? Forget everything else. It doesn't matter. a kid lost his life. Forget it. Forget it. But that's not how it's supposed to work, because that's not how it's done. And the justice system worked in this case. And, it doesn't always create the outcome that is publicly wanted on either side. But the process itself, when it's done fairly, and it was done fairly here, okay? In fact, like I said, it came out that the state had actively suppressed information that was key, and that was because what was key in understanding was the presence in the store of this young man is absolutely relevant to everything. And what his intent was in that store is relevant. Whether the state wanted it to be there or not, whether the victim's family wanted it to be there or not, it was relevant. And when that came out, if you go and you watch the trial coverage, it's there. It's after the jury deliberates and the defense puts on the record. Because during the closing argument of the final argument, not the original one, but the final argument where the solicitor of the county or the solicitor is up speaking, and they object. That moment, the reason for that objection was because the state had chose not to put the information in, and it was misleading the jury as to suggesting that he might have had pay apps on there, knowing that phone, they had done a Cellbrite report and an extraction on both phones, and neither phone was capable or had any functionality of making electronic payments, meaning that individual, when he went into the store, had no ability to pay for anything. He had no money on him. He had no money on his phone. He had no ability to pay. And that reframes everything as far as what was going on and what his mindset was and what he was looking to do. And then, again, he walks in with criminal intent potentially, which is what it appears. He's addressed. He's given the opportunity to show that there's nothing in his pocket. He refuses to do that because what's in his pocket is a gun, and instead he grabs his book bag and runs. And then creates a scenario where it becomes unsure. Well, what we do know is a shot is fired. What we do know is the two individuals that were right on the scene from the very beginning say he pulled a gun, and yes, there's a gun there. Right on the ground. Right where, that the state ultimately puts in his hands and agrees, yes, he had it in his hands. Yes, he had picked it up. But they're claiming he wasn't aiming it because he was shot in the back. But then their own expert says, not so fast. You can't rule out that he wasn't. And there it is. That's why we landed at not guilty. Not because of race, not because of anything else, not because society is wanting to see black young men get killed in the streets. Because, and yes, there are problems. Yes, there are cases that deserve to suggest that we have individuals who have done that. That there are situations where we've had people. There was one, I believe, it was out in Ohio where a young man gets dropped off and a guy comes out and shoots him, shoots this young black man in the front yard. And you know what? That individual went to prison, and rightly so, because you know what? He made assumptions, and that's wrong. And there are cases, and there are problems, but this case was being misused and was being used incorrectly based on the facts of the case. And that's why anyone who understands the actual facts of the case, when the jury was faced with it, they said no. This one doesn't pass. This one doesn't pass. And there's one other issue that I'll leave it with. And I understand this has been a hard one. And I watched an interview where there was a civil rights meeting down there, and And one of the press people were asking, they said, where's the parents' accountability in this? Like, why was a 14-year-old running around the streets with this gun? On Instagram, putting up posts. Like, this is a situation where if the parents were paying attention, they would see that their son had a gun on Instagram. They would see that he's got this firearm that he's running around and creating this danger for himself. So why are the parents are showing up in court now? The parents are involved. So where was their involvement when their son was alive to say, get that firearm out of give us the firearm. You're not carrying that around anymore. Put him in a community program. Get him some guidance. Where was the involvement? Where was it? And that question has been dodged. And the responsibility is being put on a storekeeper who had that child walk in armed. And the fact that he walked in armed that day, and the fact that he ended up losing his life because of it, doesn't give a pass to everything that came. Understanding how he got there is also understanding that we as a society must pay more attention. And I'm not putting this in a racial sense. It's all across every race, every person, every individual. We have got to pay attention to your kids. And I've had my own experiences raising 4 boys where I believe my kids are very much paid attention to. And even then, things slip through, things happen, stuff occurs that ends up shocking you because you realize you're not paying attention as close as you should be. So this is a moment as well that we must step back and realize that we have to be there. We have to be present. We have to be watching. We have to be watching social medias. We have to be accountable for what's happening and what our children are doing, because this is what happens. This is what happens when a 14-year-old goes into a store armed and he gets shot. And then you never can go back and you never can reverse that. And that is the tragedy that's being overlooked in this. That is the story that should be being discussed. Is how do we make sure that children that we are interceding when we need to, that we're paying attention, and that we're making sure that our children that we're responsible for aren't going out and putting others in danger and themselves in danger. And that if they're doing things as blatantly as being on social media and displaying a firearm, like was shown in this trial, and they have a firearm with a laser on it, there was a failure in parenting in this story that should not be overlooked. And that any parent out there should say, wait a minute, and if they were involved parents, if they were paying attention, then there really should be a reevaluation of, then how did you miss this? Because that's a sad consequence of this story, and this has a lot of consequences. But accountability deserves to be all around. And I understand that's an uncomfortable thing. There might be some of you out there that decide they don't ever watch a Justice of the Process case again because I shared that. But I believe I'm not going to step away from what's right and from telling a story appropriately. And that is what we need to be thinking about when we look at this case. And that is how we honor Cyrus, and we make sure that we figure out how to ensure that our children are being paid attention to, are being mentored appropriately, and that we're not just letting them run free out there making decisions and putting themselves at risk and putting others at risk. And we avoid ever having a scenario. There should never be a scenario. And that was what I thought was absolutely disturbing, was the prosecuting attorney who would have absolutely been saying something totally different if Mr. Chow would have been shot. They would have been having a totally different perspective on Cyrus and his family if Cyrus would have shot Mr. Chow that day, because they would have been prosecuting Cyrus, and they would have had him in there as an adult. They would have been holding him accountable, and they would have absolutely had no problem with it. And we probably wouldn't have necessarily heard anything as much about it as we would have. It might have been a case that was covered, but the bottom line is, there's no reason that a 14-year-old child, under any circumstances, should ever have a firearm, much less a firearm with a laser on it, much less taking that firearm into stores and into public places and putting themselves at risk and others at risk too. And with that, I will just say this. Keep watching, because justice works better when we watch, and it certainly did in this case. I'll talk to you guys soon.